I want to read this quote from John Mozeliak from an interview that he did on a 101 ESPN show with Brandon Kiley that sort of, to me, and maybe you could say there's an explanation for this, but it sort of flies in the face a little bit of what John Mozeliak said about the team's pursuit of starting pitching at winter warmup. The favorite quote from everybody that has gone around, and I don't remember initially when he said this. This may have been at the GM meetings or the winter meetings or whatever it was, but John Mozeliak's claim that the Cardinals had 6 starting pitchers coming into this season. That's the one Cardinals fans have picked up on the most. But the one that was the most memorable to me,
I think a lot of people had us like connected to the shortstop market, the starting pitching market, and candidly, we really weren't all that active in that. Now that might be a strategic mistake, and in hindsight, 6 months from now or a year from now, we can look back at that and say, okay, we probably should have, or our hope is that we are right, and it won't be something that we regret.
It was something that he said at winter warmup in January that I think clashes a little bit with what he said today. Some of it you could see some similarities, but I think there are some differences here as well, where BK at BK Sports Talk on Twitter shared the link to the podcast in some of the transcriptions, the quotes from Mozeliak when they spoke with him on Thursday. And here's the transcript from Mo on a question regarding the approach to starting pitching in the offseason. Mo said, hindsight is 2020, right? I can say this. There were a lot of starters that we were engaged with in the offseason, and I can tell you that almost all of them are either on the IL now or are not pitching well. And he goes on to continue to discuss the 5 starters that they believed they had. They wanted to build some protection and weren't able to do it. And then going into talking about Liberatore potentially could be a guy that allows them to have that protection maybe moving forward. But basically saying, there were a lot of starters we were engaged on in the offseason. But here's what he said back in January about the same topic, maybe to an almost identical question, when asked about the starting pitching market and the way things were explored in the offseason by the Cardinals.
I think a lot of people had us like connected to the shortstop market, the starting pitching market, and candidly, we really weren't all that active in that. Now that might be a strategic mistake, and in hindsight, 6 months from now or a year from now, we can look back at that and say, okay, we probably should have, or our hope is that we are right, and it won't be something that we regret.
Now, the description there definitely does not seem to indicate that the Cardinals were very active in the starting pitching market at all in the offseason. Now, I think the way that it ultimately ends up is the truth probably lies somewhere between the two quotes, where the Cardinals, yes, they were engaged maybe on some of these pitchers, but they didn't get very far along with any of them. Didn't necessarily get close to a deal, because in January, right on the heels of probably a lot of those conversations, and in January, the offseason's not over yet, but John Mozeliak was certainly speaking about it as if they're turning the page towards spring training and they've basically got their roster set. That's the way it seemed, at least in the way he spoke about things in that mid-January weekend. But he certainly seemed to indicate that they weren't too active at all in the starting pitching market, and folks thought they should be, right? That was the number one thing that Cardinals fans clamored for in the offseason, was some pitching help. And you got that quote from somewhere, and again, like I said, I can't remember where he said it, but 6 starters. That was the thing that stuck out to everybody. You had the 5 that began the season, and then Dakota Hudson, I think, was the 6th one. And we've talked a lot on this channel about the idea that, well, he was really talking about 6 experienced starters, 6 guys with Major League experience, to say nothing of how much you might believe in any one of the 6. They felt like they had 6 guys with experience, and they could come into spring training with that. But there's Mo today on 101 sort of admitting that they did try to get some protection and engage with a number of starters. Again, it was just kind of striking to me that he says there were a lot of starters we were engaged with in the offseason, compared to, candidly, we weren't all that involved in that when discussing the starting pitching market. So a little bit of a difference of perspective there. And I do agree with Mo on this part. The guys that they probably would have been involved with, maybe they checked in on Carlos Rodon and found out that they weren't going to get him for a song the way that they maybe hoped to. Some of the guys that I can't imagine they would have been very involved in the Verlanders or the Scherzers, the guys that were getting like $40 million short-term contracts. Would have made sense maybe, but even those guys coming up a little bit banged up at this point in time and struggling. So not to say the Cardinals didn't dodge some bullets here, but I thought it was interesting that in January, before we really knew what it looked like, the line is, well, we weren't all that involved in the starting pitching market because we feel like we've got enough guys to get us through. He said that's our hope. Our hope is that we won't look back on this and regret it, but I thought this was a key line that he actually said the quiet part out loud, that if in 6 or 12 months we look back on it, it could be considered a strategic mistake to not prioritize starting pitching more. So I understand that you could look at a number of free agents and say Carlos Rodon hasn't pitched all year. A lot of the other high-profile free agent starting pitchers that maybe the Cardinals were involved in, because we didn't get a lot of smoke around that in the offseason, right? There wasn't a ton of conversation surrounding which starters the Cardinals might be after. A lot of people said, well, you could trade for somebody. What does the trade market look like? Pablo Lopez was a guy that moved in the offseason for Luis Arraez, really good hitter that went to the Marlins. Lopez now with the Minnesota Twins. And I can remember that day, man. I think it was maybe right after the quote that I played there from Mozeliak that I asked the question more specific to the trade market, because I thought, yeah, everybody knows you need a catcher, and that was something that they set out to acquire via trade, but then ended up signing Contreras, obviously going the free agent route when things with Oakland broke down or weren't to their liking in terms of the negotiations and how the Cardinals felt about them. But I was more curious, honestly, and he didn't answer the question this way. I'd have to go back and dig through my recording from that weekend back in January to find the full quote, because the way he answered the question that I asked, which was how difficult they found the trade waters to navigate, was more in terms of the catching situation, whereas I was really kind of curious about, hey, you've got all these outfielders. You've got all these sixth starter types, these quad A guys, the Dakota Hudsons, the Jake Woodfords. We're not sure about Liberatore. They had all of these guys, and they weren't able to kind of consolidate. And the same is said of what they did with the outfield. They weren't able to consolidate and maybe package a decent starter like a Dakota Hudson that could fare well in another organization, perhaps, give somebody a fresh start, because you're just going to stash him in Memphis, and that's what the Cardinals have done. Pair somebody like that or a Jake Woodford who's deserving of a shot, although the Cardinals did end up needing to give him a shot with the Wainwright injury. But pair one of those guys with an outfielder that you don't think is all that valuable necessarily, but see what you can get for that combination and throw a prospect or two in there and see if you can't turn 3 or 4 guys. And I know that a lot of times I caution Cardinals fans against believing that quantity over quality is the way to build a trade package, because it's not. But I wasn't saying they had to shop on the top shelf with this deal. I just think they could have used that kind of trade to maybe bolster the rotation depth a little bit with somebody that had a better chance potentially to succeed than somebody like Woodford or Dakota Hudson. But I digress. Maybe those moves weren't possible. Clearly, the Cardinals didn't get any of them done. I just thought it was pretty interesting what Mo had to say on Thursday on 101. And you can check out the transcript of all of that, and the full podcast is linked at BK Sports Talk. I want to give Brandon Kiley credit because he's the one conducting the interview and putting this out there into the world on Twitter. But I thought that was very interesting in light of what Mozeliak had to say back in January. So what do you think about the Cardinals starting pitching situation? Let me know in the comments below, and make sure to like this video and subscribe to the channel, as we've got tons and tons of Cardinals content coming the rest of the way this season, doing a lot of live streams after games, maybe some watch parties down the road, but constantly you'll have Cardinals content on this YouTube channel. So make sure you subscribe and follow my podcast, Be Schaef Daily, on Spotify.